Perfect. We have about an hour left, and so doing my math, you guys went about 5 minutes over each. Matt, you went 30 seconds over. I'm going to open it up to questions. If anyone has to raise your hand, please. Yep.
Part of the problem we have with terrorism, since it is theater, it's a ballet, is that our information is so vast to the people, television, social media, etc. Are we perpetuating it by advertising it?
I think the left-wing example is an enormously important point, and I'll come to the advertisement. And in order to reduce my speech to the strict 15 minutes, I missed out a fascinating discussion on hostage negotiation and the OPEC siege in '75, which was an example of a conjunction of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and two German groups, in fact, different groups themselves, and a sort of splinter group of Baader-Meinhof, as it was then, a Rote Armee Faction, the RAF. So it was a dynamic period, and in fact, we should reflect that it was none less than Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, Carlos the Jackal, who was the leader of that group, who is now serving 3 life sentences in French prisons, the last handed down in 2017. And it's of no particular relevance, but I noted in research for this session that Carlos the Jackal will be 70 next month, which is a useless piece of information, but of some interest. The West, the
We'll do a joint card together.
yeah, and I wish him well. But the example of the ideology of Rote Armee Faction Action Directors was, I think, politically flimsy. And that is the distinction that I would draw, having been a practitioner in both eras. The rationale of the extreme view of society that was taken by the philosophers who underpinned that era has died fairly rapidly. And I think its depth was its route to extinction, or partial extinction. We still see it in some form. The great change, I think, that's occurred from that generation to this is the depth of the underpinning, the ideology. And I think the gripping nature of the ideology which underpins particularly the Salafi jihadist threat in all its forms is utterly unrecognizable from what we went through in the 70s and the 80s with the extreme left-wing terrorist groups. And I think, sadly, whereas one could look into, as they say, the bottom of the barrel on that threat in the 70s and the 80s. I don't think sitting here this morning that we have that privilege with the long-term Salafi jihadist threat, which I think, Lorenzo, I disagree with some of your optimism about where we are. I think in many ways the global spread of the ideology, and we had it drawn dramatically to our attention yesterday. Look at where the Salafi jihadist threat is today compared where it was 18 years ago today. It has spread dramatically, and again, the South Sahara, or the Sahel south of the Sahara, is the most gripping example. We've got a threat that goes from the Atlantic littoral states all across Africa, traversing Nigeria, into Somalia in the east, down into Kenya and elsewhere. Now that is, in the course of 18 years, is a growth that is extremely undesirable, and it won't be rolled back in my lifetime, certainly. And I don't think we can see the combating of the ideology in the same way. Your final point, and I'm sorry I avoided your question up till now, is that do we, in many ways, advertise what we're... I think in many ways we can, they call it in the UK the Wickhamist fallacy. There's a wonderful public school called Winchester, that nobody can afford. But the pupils and alumni of Winchester are known as the Wickhamists. And the Wickhamist view of the world is firmly based in Winchester, where the school is in southern England. This means a view that doesn't encompass much of the world outwith of southern England. And the Wickhamist fallacy is alive and well amongst us all. I think we take a view of this challenge, which is Western-centric. We come up with Western-centric solutions, and we don't see this challenge from Africa. We don't see it from South Asia. We don't see it into the Philippines and Indonesia, which is where we ought to be looking. We've got the telescope the wrong way round. So I think, yes, we should be concerned that terrorism is not unduly aggrandized, and I think that's why this Enough is Enough movement is really splendid and a thoroughly good idea. But I think we should be realistic. What matters is not about a group of individuals who are watching CNN in New York. It's people who are in the depths of Africa. Just to illustrate it, and I won't prolong this, I won't be longer than 15 minutes, Shane, in the course of my UN career, I dealt with a hostage-taking which was in the Sahel, and there were Canadian diplomats who rather ill-advisedly had gone on a sort of slightly flaky mission into territory that they would have been wiser to avoid. They were taken by a group that was linked with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, so it's your worst nightmare. You've lost members of staff. Who's holding them? It's AQ. So it's a bad day. We got through the episode, and in the end, I debriefed the Canadian diplomat who'd been released, and he went to enormous pains. He said, "You have got to emphasize, David, to people the nature of these people." He said, when we were released, they did it by way of a tribal ceremony. He said, first of all, we were told there was only a dozen of them. He said, there were 2 sand dunes, each with the obligatory Toyota with a 50 cal on it, on each sand dune. And there's 100 bandits in between the various sand dunes. So we weren't 12, we were 100. And he said their contact with the world was one shaky phone whereby they were contacting occasionally the outside world. He said their mentality was of 7th century medieval warriors. Those are the people who are holding me. So I fear that our reach has got to go to the mindset of a 7th century medieval warrior who is living in sand dunes in the south of the Sahara, and that, I think, is a difficult ask. So I hope that's not too long a response.
I'll come to you next, I promise.
Okay, thank you very much. Really, I have 2 questions. First of all, a question for Dr. Marone. When you described the level of radicalization in Italy, you mentioned only law enforcement factors. And how do you think, is there any religious factor, of course, which contributes to the low level of radicalization? And another question for the whole panel. As we see now, UN entities now are implementing different projects on the so-called PVE, Prevention of Violent Extremism. And now they focus their activities exclusively on developing countries. How do you think, is it now time for UN agencies and other entities to refocus its activities on developed countries if we take into account the level of homegrown terrorism in the West? Thank you.
Thank you. The question is about a religious effect, the presence of the Catholic Church. Okay. Yes, yes, there are other Catholic countries which present higher levels of radicalization. I think that there could be a Catholic effect, for example, in the involvement of Catholic association with migrants. So we don't have a very high level of marginalization in specific geographical areas in Italy, like other countries such as Belgium or France. So we don't have this kind of cities within the cities in which the police is not able to go to operate so far, but probably there will be some example of this type of ghetto in the future. And probably one of the reasons of this quite happy situation now is a very active involvement of Catholic association, because they can give some services that the state, for example, is not able to give, and they are able probably to collect information at the local level. They can be able to understand the situation in every city, town, district. So probably intentionally or sometimes unintentionally, Catholic association, which are obviously very, very active in Italy, can have a role, probably an indirect role in creating this so far quite positive condition at the macro level. On the other hand, obviously, the Vatican represents an important objective for this kind of propaganda. We have seen different terrorist plots in which terrorists try to plot, to plan terrorist attacks on the Vatican. Thank you.
So then do you want to take it, or Matt, the UN question?
I'll take the UN. I'll start, and you can then correct me.
Yeah.
I think I challenge the premise of the question. I've lost count of the number of UN, CVE, PVE, TP, whatever you want to, conferences I've participated in that focus not only on developing world but on the developed world as well. It's just the nature of the UN that we're talking primarily about assistance and training and funding, and so that is going to be focused on developing countries that need that assistance. But the innumerable number of CVE conferences I've focused on have not only been like, first world countries telling the rest of the world how to operate. There's been a lot of sharing. I remember one on terrorist recruitment and radicalization in prisons. The UK sent an excellent delegation. They have a tremendous amount of experience there. The US Bureau of Prisons sent a delegation, but some of the most informative delegations were from Jordan and Indonesia and a host of other countries that were more in the developing world that had a tremendous amount to contribute to those in the Western world. So I really think there is a little bit more give and take. Programmatically, the focus is where is there a need that UN programming can address, and when that involves training and money, that's going to primarily be in the developing world.
I naturally agree with everything that Matt has said. It tempts me, before I get back to your questions, for an aside. When I was working at the UN during a period there, the United States permanent representative to the United Nations was none other than Mr. John Bolton, who devoted his entire period as permanent representative to undermining the UN to which he was assigned to support. So if I might say so, the news of his sacking overnight is a particular source of joy, even though that is an unworthy observation.
I would just say that you got to be careful right now poking fun at the U.S. political system when you're coming from London.
No, I appreciate it. Yeah.
Awfully judgy.
Bad that we haven't quite achieved a John Bolton. The answer, I think, is I'd add to Matt the complexity of the evolution of the system. I think is a factor. I think the resources, the new agencies, the development of the various complex bodies. I mean, it's an impressive map nowadays. All of that is to be enormously applauded. But I think we should understand that, particularly with capability and capacity building, which has been one of the challenging agendas, and I think the UN, has only effectively recently moved into that area. I look to it, the man who actually knows. So I think it's understandable that I agree with Matt that on areas like CVE there has been a balance more between the developed and the developing world. But I think really on the real heartland of counter-terrorism and building up capacity that's going to matter amongst decision makers in government and those who are working for them. It's perhaps understandable that the head of UN Counter-Terrorism has chosen firstly to look at those countries that appear to be more vulnerable. The point you make, I think, is enormously important. My former colleagues at Scotland Yard were quite emphatic that we shouldn't regard the underdeveloped world as being the problem, but there were some developed nations who were not world-class at counter-terrorism. So I think it's a sobering issue, if I can be candid. And just to underline that, can I say a word about the overall capacity and capability effort on planet Earth, because I think it's a serious issue, and what you've highlighted with the UN is an important factor, but it's not the only factor, because virtually all the member states are in some way engaged in capability building. I put before you that rather sad comment from our Western colleague in the Sahel and building sandcastles at low tide. The additional problem is that there's an awful lot of sandcastle builders. I do a bit of capability and capacity building because you've grey hair, you're given the role of being politely rude to the Prime Minister and encouraging to do slightly more. It's called strategic capacity and capability building. But what's sad about the capability and capacity world is that as you go to the airport, the Poles are just leaving. Some British police forces come in next Tuesday, and they're doing much the same thing. The degree of coordination, cohesion, and integration that we ought to be achieving in global capacity and capability building it falls short of the target because we are not as organized as we could be. It would require the creation of another UN, the global coalition on capability and capacity building. But I think there's a real point about getting our house in order. And there are a number of key nations who could take the lead on that. The United States is an absolutely seminal example that there are major European players. But we need to do more. But to be blunt, even in my own country, regrettably, one sees confusion, duplication, and sadly, a bit of wasted effort. So I apologise if it's a lengthy answer.
Thank you. With regard to this phenomenon of the great diversity and the outcomes of these various different countries, and in particular, as Dr. Vedino said, the African countries, maybe the Arab countries versus European countries, and as you said as well. I'm wondering if perhaps a parameter distinction could be made of the following sort. You could look at terrorism as a criminal phenomenon and try to be very careful about being politically correct and not offending or inciting Islamophobia, perhaps. Or you can look, or you can look at terrorism as being a cultural phenomenon, in which case you would want to infiltrate mosques and ally yourself with moderate Muslims who have perhaps an agenda against the Islamists. So the question then becomes that of politics. Is political correctness a factor in how effective countries are in dealing with the roots of this problem? Is it a criminal problem? Is it a cultural problem? Is that a distinction worth making?
Don't all jump at once. Come on, guys.
No. Look, we have in the United States now arguably a much bigger problem from domestic terrorists, white supremacists, than we do from any other ism. Throughout history, there have been Irish Catholic terrorists and there have been Jewish terrorists, and we're seeing a period of radical Islamist terrorism. But I don't think that it's accurate to say that this is a cultural phenomenon, that it's unique to any one particular culture. It has been more unique to certain cultures at certain periods of time, and as history cycles through, pretty much all cultures have had their opportunities to be violent, politically violent, and violent targeting civilians. I started my career in FBI counterterrorism. If we had reason to look at a religious institution, whether it was a mosque or a synagogue or a church, we had real reason to do it, we would do it. But you don't go looking at every mosque or every synagogue or every church because you've had some instances where there were people who were violent from that particular community. So you're looking for behaviors, and then you're looking for, as you've heard from several speakers now, especially Lorenzo's, the combination of factors that are leading people at a particular time, and because hotspotting is a real issue in a particular place, to engage in a particular way. You know, I was in Brussels during the Brussels attack. In fact, I was sitting with the head of federal counterterrorism police as he was planning the raid a couple of neighborhoods over where they just missed Salah Abdeslam, and then they caught him 2 days later. And I kept coming back to Molenbeek in particular several times over the next few years, and became good friends with we in the United States, we'd call it community policing, a local police officer, not a counterterrorism officer, but officer working on CVE together with the prevention officers working for the mayor's office. And would visit him, still visit him from time to time. And if you look at the nature of the way people were radicalized in a hot spot like Molenbeek, it was quite unique to that circumstance. And it had a lot less to do with religion. We're talking about people who weren't religious. They didn't know how many times a day they were supposed to pray, and they certainly didn't pray 5 times a day. They were still taking drugs, they were still womanizing, they were doing everything else. This just became a way to explain all the bad stuff that was happening to them and to justify the violent behaviors some of them wanted to engage in, and enabled them, as he put it to me, and I've since used this over and over, but he knows I've stolen it for him, so it's okay. They were able to go from zero to hero. That has a lot less to do with the culture of Belgium, the culture of being a Muslim. It has a lot more to do with the personal circumstance of those young men in that neighborhood. So I think it's very important to look at what behaviors are being done. And ultimately, yes, those behaviors are criminal. That's the problem. At least in the United States, we're not thought police.
Very briefly, I agree with everything Matt said, because that's the rule of the panel, right? So that I would say every single thing he said is correct. I would add though one thing. I mean, especially the point he made about the fact that every culture has experienced that, and you look at the different waves of terrorism, the ways of David Rappaport's historical work on different waves of terrorism clearly shows that it's been in every culture, and there's moments, ebbs and flows, and that's the way it goes. To your point about whether, to some degree, political correctness blinds us or ties our hands, without exaggerating, I would say, but yes, and on certain things, yes, I would say so. I made a point in trying to be as sophisticated as possible in the analysis of radicalization, showing how it's a combination of different factors. But I think there is, in a Western setting, with with a lot of differences from country to country, but a reluctance to get into the ideological aspect of it. I find oddly, it's superficially oddly, the debate much more open in some Arab countries about the nature of the relationship between ideology, a certain ideology, that in recent years many countries, some of them that in the past were not so great, but they themselves had a role in funding a big machine that spread a certain thinking in Islam worldwide, in calling it political Islam and having no problem in doing that. And I sometimes find myself in places in the Arab world where there's an openness to talk about political Islam, even in its non-violent manifestations, being the source, together with all the sociological, economical, political, psychological issues we talked about, being the source of a lot of problems. And sometimes the conversation is much more open and frank than it is in Western countries, where we are, for understandable reasons, reluctant to get into that kind of conversation. That is also a shameless plug for the panel I'm moderating in the afternoon, which is about non-violent Islamism in the West, to which you're all invited, so we can have more deeper conversation about this.
1 minute. Thanks for your question, sir. It gives me the opportunity to be optimistic, polite, and positive. I'm optimistic because I think there has been an identifiable change, particularly amongst the nation-state level, since 9/11, and a movement in attitude where very commonly you would encounter denial or rejection of a set of analysis of the problem as it was seen in that particular location, on whatever grounds, political, religious, or other ideological. That is less the case now, 18 years on, than it was in the pre-9/11 and 9/11 period. I think the understanding the death of the one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, which I hope we will never hear again, the defense of various, you're attacking my beliefs, that is far less common amongst the debate. And I think it would be surprising in an engagement in most serious governments across the world if one doesn't able to achieve a very realistic appreciation of the true problem as a basis for debate. So I'm hopeful in that direction.
Yeah, I would like to challenge the title of this whole panel, namely the notion of homegrown terrorism. Because of course there's nothing wrong with it if it would be just something descriptive, denoting that some terrorists are foreign born or foreign socialized, and others are native born and domestically socialized and radicalized within a particular country. But that is not what the notion of homegrown terrorism conveys alone. It conveys something also about the causes of radicalization and terrorism, namely that these causes are homegrown. And I think that's a very misleading notion, not for all kinds of radicalization, but if we apply it to Islamic radicalization, I think there's no denying that the very, very, very large majority of terrorists and terrorist incidents occur in the Islamic world. That's also where it has started. So to analyze homegrown terrorism as if it was something decoupled, as if it was a different kind of terrorism, a different kind of radicalization with different types of causes that are very local, that are maybe even situated in a neighborhood, as Mr. Levitt just suggested, that can be very misleading. I don't want to say that we should not look also at domestic aspects, and of course it's not entirely random which people radicalize and in which localities people radicalize, but the root causes of the problem of Islamic radicalism are very, very clearly within the Islamic world. And if we create a notion, an analytical tool that directs our attention to domestic causes and to domestic factors, I think we are just looking the wrong way. And I see within the panel very different views on that, actually from left to right. I think the point of view I'm criticizing is mostly that of Mr. Levitt, and least so that of Mr. Vidino, and the others have positions in between. So I would be very interested in seeing the reactions of the panel.
I'm actually probably not very far off of that. A little bit different. So I looked at homegrown terrorism in the West, and as a practitioner on the ground who has enjoyed it up close and personal, and has visited many countries in the past 3 decades, some of which we were invited to. It's some homegrown terrorism. I'm trying to figure out what's it matter in the sense of, it's almost like a competition. Are we looking to define that our domestic terrorists are better than somebody else's exported terrorists? Because at the end of the day, as far as I would be concerned, they're just terrorists. And it kind of leans, I would believe, sir, David, into what you were talking about. And I've dealt in the counter-IED community quite a bit, and it took us 17 years to come up with a common lexicon just so that we could understand what a bomb is. But I think everybody in the room pretty much has a pretty good idea of what a bomb is. But the lexicon wasn't approved until 17 years in. It still hasn't been approved by the UN. It's only been approved by NATO and some other countries. We come up with a lexicon, and we don't necessarily have a common lexicon now of what a terrorist is and what it means. So are we not compartmentalizing so that we can then apply resources toward our specific issue, whether it be the US or the EU or wherever, and instead of looking at the bigger threat and the bigger problem, and it goes back to that collaboration and that working together, do we not employ people and put time, energy, and money into defining what it ultimately ends up being our personal issue, vice working collectively as a community across the world?
Anyone want to answer the question why this panel is not right?
Well, I'll start, because I think it's the first time in a long time I've been the one described as being on the left, and it's kind of a new perspective. I think I might like it. But having worked with Lorenzo for many, many, many years, I'll let him describe. I'm curious as to how you're going to describe yourself as different on this. I don't think we are. So let me tackle this. The reason HVE as a term doesn't appear in the U.S. national security strategy and the counterterrorism strategy is just because of this concern. Some people felt, well, just call a terrorist a terrorist. What's the difference? Well, FBI came up with the term because it was useful for the FBI to start describing someone who, unlike when I started in counterterrorism at the FBI in the years before 9/11, we were looking for people who traveled. We were looking for people who were in direct communication with known terrorists at home or abroad. But almost always that had some type of foreign connection. We were looking maybe for transfer of money. Nowadays, none of those tripwires, none of those key traditional tripwires are necessarily going to appear in the type of cases we're seeing today. So you got a kid in a community whose life is not going well and is looking for easy answers to difficult life questions, and sees something on the computer in his mama's basement because he doesn't have great social skills and he's hanging out there too long, and comes across stuff and decides to try and do something at home if he can't travel abroad. You're actually seeing something that is starting not with religion or religious ideology. You're seeing something that's starting with their local, for lack of a better term, I don't really love this term, but the term that people tend to use is grievance. What are the issues? And it could easily be his girlfriend dumped him, or he didn't get into the college, or whatever it is. If you can make faces, but as someone who actually has done these cases, more cases start with someone who's then looking for the ideology, then starts with the ideology, says, ooh, I want to be a radical Islamist, now I can do whatever violence I want. That then the ideology that fills their intellectual gap is one that is, in this case, Islamic extremist, or it could be white supremacist extremist. That's a huge problem and gets to Lorenzo's point that we haven't succeeded in dealing with the ideology, but I have yet to find a case, a single one, that doesn't involve both ideology and grievance. I'm not saying there'll be 50-50, that almost never happens either. But in the cases in Molenbeek, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, the vast majority of those cases are not religious, ideological, Islamist ideology cases as they start. And where we are going to have the biggest bang for our buck in countering violent extremism is identifying when people, usually young people, but not only, are having things going on that are leading them down a path before they get to the point where an ideology tells them you not only can carry out violence targeting civilians, but it's good and it's doing what God wants, etc. So I think it'd be very easy, it'd be much simpler if this were just a question of, well, which are the bad communities? Or where's the bad ideology and it's coming from outside? In the nature of the interconnected social media, all types of, access, everything's on here nowadays, it's incorrect to say nowadays that Islamic practice of whatever legitimate, moderate, or extremist variation for someone who's living in the United States has come from abroad. There is an American Islam. You have a kid who's born in America, he discovers it's there, he's never traveled abroad, he's never been in direct contact necessarily with anybody abroad. So it's not as so simple as just to say that it's all about the ideology. So what HVE was intended to do, and the reason the FBI came up with the term, is to try and help us understand, per the footnote in the counterterrorism strategy that I put up on the screen, we're dealing with people who are radicalized at home, often by people, when it's in person, at home, and haven't traveled off or not affiliated with any foreign terrorist organization, a designated organization or otherwise. It's this really unique phenomenon that puts real challenges for law enforcement in terms of how you address these kind of, I don't like the term lone wolf so much because wolves actually travel in packs, but lone offenders. That's what it's meant to do. It's not meant to be a softer term than terrorism. They are terrorists. It's trying to understand what's the process by which some of these people are getting there, and can we deal with the people who haven't gone all the way down the process and provide off-ramps to interventions to prevent them from getting there all the way to terrorism. Ultimately, that's how we're going to get ahead of the curve.
Sure. No, it's very brief because, of course, I agree with Matt and check. So it's again, nothing to say. No, I mean, since we conceived the panel, I think it's worth a reply. Listen, I think the category, I mean, it's a term of art, and I think it has a value. It has a value looking specifically at the region, because if you, whether you're a practitioner, you're an academic, there are specificities. Yeah, neighborhood by neighborhood, yes, country by country, region by region. The ideology might be the same, but the reasons why people join Al-Shabaab in Somalia nothing to do with the reason, or have little to do with the reasons why somebody joins ISIS in Molenbeek, in Milan, in Stockholm, and so on and so forth. Many people would join jihadist groups in Africa because they get a salary of a few $100. Okay, does that apply to people who join in the West? No, nobody would join from the West for money. Nobody does that for the few €100 they would get in Syria. So one has to look specifically, region by region, country by country, neighborhood by neighborhood, as to what the dynamics are. I think there's an enormous analytical value in doing that. There are legal implications in what is domestic and what is foreign. From a US point of view, foreign terrorist organization, whole different set of rules as to domestic, and that's of course a big debate these days as to designation of domestic terrorism and so on and so forth. So yeah, you get to these very strange issues of syntax, of terminology. Somebody's homegrown, but is espousing a foreign ideology. So is it domestic terrorism or not? Yes, and I understand it's a matter of terminology and sometimes splitting hairs for a variety of reasons. But there are important, as I said, analytical and legal implications in doing that. I think to your last, talking to the gentleman in black, about it's an external ideology. It is true that obviously, originally, the ideology, whether we want to look at political Islam in general or just more specifically about jihadism, which is the most violent manifestation of political Islam, let's put it with a lot of oversimplifications, it's a foreign import. It goes without saying. But it has taken on very Western connotations. Jihadism in the West, the way it functions, is very different from the way it functions in Somalia, in Pakistan, in the Gaza Strip. It has its own terminology, its own subculture. its own very different dynamics. The way you would recruit in Molenbeek is not the way you would recruit in Gaza or in Mogadishu. So it has become, it is original import, but it has become somewhat a Western ideology. So there's not just a legal analytical point of view, but it is something domestic that we have to deal with. Yep.
Good. For the first time in my adult life, I'm going to firmly disagree with Matt. Can I take an example? Because I think both questions are extremely apt, and I think you made a powerful and interesting point, and I think it's more than semantics, as I'll come on to. I think it produces the wrong answers. So I think there are dangers. When I was head of counter-terrorism at Scotland Yard, if a young detective came to me dealing with a particular terrorist case and assured me that there was no foreign dimension whatsoever to the case, I would, I hope, politely advise them in a spirit of career development to go away and try and be a slightly better detective, because a slightly better detective would have found at least one foreign element that was part of this particular case. There is no such thing as an insulated, on its own, homegrown case which doesn't have, for example, just access to propaganda. So let me give the three reasons why I think it's more than semantics. And this is really because I think it's the wrong place to start. Firstly, we ought to start global and not local in the sense of a national jurisdiction. The threat we are dealing with overwhelmingly is a global jihadist threat. That's the main issue. We are not dealing with 192 homegrown threats, or 193, sorry, member states of the which are operating in silos, which don't come together. And to start with the national and not to start with the global is to completely miss the point. So I think it's philosophically an enormous, important entree into understanding 21st century terrorism. My second point is I think if you go down the homegrown domestic extremism route, you get yourself into a legal pickle. With great respect to the United States, I think that's the position that the United States is now in. I think having a different regime for international terrorism and domestic terrorism is a mistake. I'm sure that over time it will be corrected. It'll probably take some pain and suffering in order to achieve that. I quite understand why the American legal system is in this pickle at the moment, because that's where the antecedent history has led to. There are different political origins, and that's led to the political arrangement, and that the structures have arisen around that. I say that with some confidence because the UK has just emerged from that mistake. We went through 5 horrible terrorist incidents in 2017, which included a right-wing attack. That was reviewed by one of the best counter-terrorist minds that I know of, who is a former senior lawyer, who looked at our arrangements. He looked at the cooperation between police and MI5. He looked at everything that was relevant. One of the key recommendations he produced is that we were very dumb to be dealing with national terrorism, extreme right wing, on a different basis to international terrorism, because the two are part of terrorism, and the law depicts, although not in specific regimes. So we have now changed. That led to some important arrangements. First of all, MI5, our internal security service, did not deal with domestic extremism. They dealt with international and other threats. That has changed. They now encompass the threat of domestic extremism within their remit. That gives you immense benefits. You now get all the assets of the intelligence and security world, their links to overseas liaison in 193 states on planet Earth. I mean, it's a game changer, and it transforms your ability in order to deal with the problem. and it makes it much more straightforward in addressing it. Sorry, okay. Apologies. In addressing it in terms of how the criminal courts, etc. So what I'm saying is this is an issue that has real consequences, and I think I put the UK mistake, which has now been corrected, before you. And we're in a much better place now than we are. That's why I suggest that I think the American experience will move on in due course once enlightenment occurs. The third point is that if you think nationally, you don't think about international collaboration, which is the point that my friend there was making as your starting point about how you're going to approach the problem. And that denies you all of the benefits that overseas linkage, cooperation brings about. So I do think you both have raised important questions, and I think we ought to look carefully at the way this issue is evolving in different jurisdictions around the world, and where best practice is to be found.
Let me, just 1 second.
Just 1 second.
1 second.
So I just want to make two clarifications. Yep. An HVE investigation is an international investigation with all of the, and if you look at that footnote, it makes it very, very clear. The legal pickle issue has nothing to do with HVE. HVE cases are international terrorism cases. So the legal pickle issue that you're referring to has zero to do with this panel discussion. It has only to do with truly domestic terrorism cases of the white supremacist nature for whom there's no material support law. It's a completely separate conversation. So ultimately, well, okay. I mean, you'd be wrong, but that's okay. So the only issue is how did they get to the point where they are considering violence, in this case in the context of international terrorism. It's the radicalization process. That's all it is, and that's the purpose of the term.
Okay. So we have time. I'm going to ask 3 questions in a row, and then the panel can ask. Sir, you've been waiting patiently. No, Claire, and then the gentleman in the back with his hand up. No, just questions.
I agree with Matt on the tactical level, but on the strategic level, I think Sir Vanessa is right. Just lately, the Sri Lankan government has expelled the Saudi Wahhabi imams, which were responsible for the radicalization of those which attacked the churches. Okay, although they said that they are ISIS. In the 2000s, I spoke with Xinjiang officials, very high officials, about radicalization and suicide bombings in Xinjiang at that time. And I asked, who is building the hundreds of mosques in Xinjiang? They said me, the Saudis. So I asked, so why do they permit? We have excellent relations with the Saudis. And the end of the 80s, I spoke with Turkish military responsibles and asked why in Ankara there are hundreds of new mosques built by Iranians and Saudis, a year before a huge wave of jihadist Sunnis attacks against the regime, by the way, financed by the Iranians. Understand? We have excellent relations with the Iranians and the Saudis. And my question, by the way, is what happens today with the Wahhabi Saudi regime, which is a very sensitive political question, especially today in Israel?
Hi, Claire Abrahams. Thank you all very much for talking. My question goes to what you were saying, Dr. Vedino, earlier about how in the US there tends to be less in-person radicalizers, connectors than in Europe and elsewhere. And also how traditionally in the US, in-prison radicalization hasn't been as much of an issue as in Europe. I'm wondering now that we're seeing a lot of the new cases coming in and now out of prisons, if you think in the US that in-person radicalizers are going to be more of an issue, and connected to that, what do you recommend, I guess, to the panel at large in terms of US DRAD programs in US prisons, especially given the fact that those individuals who do truly adhere to jihadist ideology rather than joining for other void-filling reasons have no issue in the long game of like holding on to their views and doing something like much further down the line. Thank you.
Something interesting was said about how folks that are radicalized in the West, what their interaction effect may be with people in other countries, might be their country of origin or where their family is from, if they're second or third generation, what have you. I think it was Tunisia that was talked about. I'm actually really interested in what that looks like as far as homegrown violent extremists in Western European countries and how they affect maybe specifically North African countries, because a lot of attention is given to Algerians and Moroccans and all of these other folks in Western European countries, and I'm curious if those folks have an effect on people in those countries.
It's basically there's a lack of programs in general. I mean, when a few months ago was the incident, was John Walker Lynn being released from prison, which was an incident. Everybody knew, I mean, he served his time. And there was, of course, a 48-hour media freak out. We have somebody, American Taliban is coming. I made it for a good story, but it doesn't lead. It's one of those things that, of course, I'm not privy to all the conversations in government. I do know that within DOJ, the Bureau of Prisons, within the FBI, there are concerns about what goes on in the prison system, but then there's a general paralysis within the US government, and this transcends administration. This is not just with its current administration, which is averse to CV, at least in term, but also to some degree, not just in terms, but also previous one. There hasn't been much of an investment in all this, but this is really Seamus' topic, so he should be talking about it for at least a couple of minutes. I will, before he does that, I will address the question on Westerners going back to their countries of origin and sort of to some degree being problematic there. And it is to some degree a mini trend. If I think of the Tunisian case and the rise of Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, which was arguably the driving force. I mean, Aaron Zellin is the master on that. He knows, and he talked about it the other day, is arguably the reason why Tunisia has seen such a massive mobilization for ISIS. Ansar al-Sharia is started by some local guys, but mostly by a bunch of Tunisian guys who had been expelled from Italy under the law that Francesco was talking about, which is allows Italian authorities to expel people at ease. But these guys, when they go back, what do they do there? So from an Italian point of view, in a somewhat selfish way, it works. But of course, the problem is just sort of outsourced somewhere else. And a lot of these individuals, radicalized, embittered, if you will, once back in post-Ben Ali Tunisia with Al-Nahda government being somewhat benevolent, or at least looking the other way, they had the ability to create a network that was very, very efficient. You have a lot of anecdotes even throughout North Africa, Western networks creating problems there. One of the latest very gruesome attacks in Morocco with the two Scandinavian ladies being beheaded in a very ritualistic way. Not the actual perpetrators, but our investigation is still ongoing, but the individuals who funded, radicalized those individuals were Moroccans who had grown up, who had born, or at least spent substantial amount of their life in Europe and had gone back and were radicalizing other people. So it is a trend. It is something that is highly, it's the unintended consequences, if you will, in the case of the Italian case of counter-terrorism. So it is a trend. You're giving me the, but you have to talk now about the prison stuff.
The short answer to the question of, should we worry about individuals who get out of jail being kind of the next wave of in-person recruitment? The answer is yes, and there's examples of that in recent history. So there's a guy from Texas named John Georgelis, got arrested for hacking the APAC website in the early 2000s, was released under FBI investigation, ran a small study group down the street from the mosque because he got kicked out from the mosque. And there's a dozen cases under investigation related to that study group, including at least 4 or 5 individuals who left and traveled to go to Syria and Iraq. The U.S. government is not situated to deal with this problem. You've got probation services that have to check in, and what are they doing when they knock on the door? What are they looking for? What are the signs of radicalization, whatever that may be? U.S. attorneys' offices are not keen to take these cases on. The FBI is looking around and saying, I don't have enough to open a active investigation, which means I can't do surveillance given the way our structure is set up. And if I do I do it for 2 weeks, 2 years, 20 years, right? It's not something we figured out, and yes, it's going to be a concern. In fact, in the ISIS cases, you've got 194 folks in the U.S. have been charged with ISIS-related activities. Something north of 25 to 30 been out in the last year or so, and the wave gets bigger and bigger as it goes from there. And this is an issue that the U.S. government hasn't addressed whatsoever. That's how you do it in 30 seconds, guys.
Can I say the Sri Lanka example is a brilliant one, so brilliant I wish I'd thought of it earlier, because it illustrates precisely the point that I think was slightly cross purposes in our definition with Matt. Sri Lanka seems to me such a brilliant example, A, because it's recent and absolutely gripping in the adverse circumstances, the total breakdown between the political leadership, the leadership of the intelligence and security services, and those who might have saved lives. And it was because the Sri Lankan authorities were in a post-Tamil Tiger mood, and their telescope was on Tamil Tiger and the post-era. It wasn't on the burgeoning threat internally, which was not being adequately addressed, of linkages to the Salafist jihadist movement. So I think it's a really outstanding example. On the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I think to draw a distinction between external policies, and I think the Wahhabi dimension perhaps contributes to interventions by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that maybe are not in the broadest interests of global peace and security. But we need to recognize that at the operational level, virtually all of the states of the member states of the United Nations, including Saudi Arabia, are crystal clear in their analysis and in the action that needs to be taken. So I think there's a distinction between the political and the operational engagement.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I think that's going to have to be the last word. First, I want to thank ICT for hosting this conference and allowing the program on extremism to propose this. I'd like to thank my panelists for a distinguished 3 hours, and you all for sticking around for 3 hours. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking them.